Hello, Red Waters listeners. This is your host, Doublespeak. I just want to take the time to give you a bit of an introduction into our very special guest this evening, a philosopher of history, an economist, a journalist, and a lecturer. He has his BA degree, summa cum laude in English and Italian from Princeton University. He's a member of Phi Beta Kappa and was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Turin in Italy. He has a master's degree in humanities from Skidmore College, PhD from the Catholic University of American History. He speaks fluently in Italian, German, French, Latin, and Russian. He has a radio show, which I suggest everybody check out, and we'll be dropping the name of it quite a bit through this interview. His show is called World Crisis Radio, which you can find at tarpley.net. That is his website. The information he provides is concrete. The information that he provides is filled with tidbits of information. So pull out your pens, your pencils, because this evening we have Webster Tarpley on Red Waters, and it's a very special opportunity for us. So thank you very much, Mr. Tarpley, for being on the show today.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure of ours to have you here speaking to the university community and Winnipeg's FM radio community as well. I know that we have limited time, so I want to jump into it because the things you have to say are incredibly influential and educational, and I want to give you as much time to speak as possible. So we did discuss already a general idea of the various topics we were going to jump into. I would love for you to start. We were going to speak about a little bit of the history of World War I and some of the similarities you've been making through your site, tarpley.net.
Yes, I would urge everyone to take a long historical view and try to keep things in perspective and see that some of the problems we face today are not so new. And we can certainly learn a lot by studying what happens to be now the 100th anniversary of these terrible events of July and August 1914, which started the greatest cataclysm of world civilization that we've ever seen, right? Remembering that World War II grew out of World War I, as did fascism, communism, and a whole series of other things, the Great Depression, ultimately the Cold War, and that brings us more or less where we are today. And if you've been following the debates about World War I, I'm afraid that the quality of the historical research is rather low, because what dominates is an attempt to whitewash the activities of this group of nations known as the Triple Entente, that is to say, France, Russia, and Great Britain. That's the original Triple Entente. And then, unfortunately, they were joined by the United States and by a whole series of other countries, even Latin America and other places far afield. Japan was also a member of this Triple Entente. So you can see the seeds of war, not just the Second World War in Europe, but the Second World War in Asia growing out of this. And the big question, of course, is who's responsible, right? Who has war guilt? The Versailles Treaty of 1919 says Germany and Vienna have exclusive war guilt, and the others are innocent babes. And I'm afraid this is, to some degree, the reverse of reality. Mm-hmm. And for the past 20 years, I have been representing a direction of research which is obvious enough if you actually look at the documents of the time. It is the activities of King Edward VII, the King of England in the first decade of the 20th century, but we also have to remember that he had been Prince of Wales for many, many decades, for at least 50 years before that, going back to 1860. He'd been the clear heir apparent to the throne. Queen Victoria lived a long life, and he lived in her shadow, but what he was doing all that time was to busily create a network. And this network it's what history refers to as the tremendous growth of Freemasonic lodges in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Right, King Edward VII was the boss of the Scottish Rite, which extends into the United States and I'm sure also into Canada. Absolutely. And he was also then the dominant figure of the Grand Orient lodges, centered in France, but extending it to Italy, Spain, Portugal, Latin America. And then other Freemasonic groups in the Russian Empire, in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Turkey, the Young Turks, essentially a Freemasonic movement. And the idea of these Freemasonic lodges was the eternalization of British world domination and the preservation of the British Empire against what they considered to be a German challenge. And the German challenge was primarily economic. That is, the much higher rates of economic, scientific, technological, industrial development in Germany compared to Great Britain. And they could have solved this by gearing up British industry. Perfectly possible, but that would have challenged the hierarchical, aristocratic social order and its values. So they decided that war was the only way out of it. So when we look at the beginning of World War I, the first thing you notice is that it's these alliance systems that clash, right? The Triple Entente, masterminded by King Edward VII, and then this other one, the Triple Alliance, which was really not triple at all, but that was supposed to be Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And Italy, of course, had fallen away from it as soon as the shooting started. But the big thing about the Triple Entente is that this was the idea of King Edward VII. He got this concept comes from him,
yes,
and he assembled it himself personally through royal visits, dynastic diplomacy, and the activities of this network that he had going. So that we can say that the British-French Entente Cordiale of 1903, that's done under King Edward personally. He's right there on the scene, leading the talks, coming up with the ideas, choosing the personnel. And then the British-Russian Entente of 1907-1908. And again, it's King Edward who is absolutely in the lead. You will notice then that these very obvious facts, right, which are all over the literature of the time, diaries, newspapers, commentaries, tend to be suppressed, right? There's books by some scholars like The Sleepwalkers, right? That's the most prominent one, I think, at the moment, which is the idea that everybody drifted into war. Nobody knew what was happening. It was war by miscalculation all around. And this is simply fatuous. It's not true. And in reality, I think that the case against Germany as an aggressor is the weakest. Far more damning cases can be made against the others. Edward VII, as I mentioned, had this network, and he was able to promote the careers of foreign officials. And let me just mention two of them.
Of course.
One is the Russian foreign minister, and then later the Russian ambassador in Paris, but still the dominant force in Russian foreign policy is someone named Izvolsky. And Izvolsky went around in the 1920s boasting that he was the father of World War I and that it had been his war. And to a certain degree, this is true once the alliance system had been created. On the other side, King Edward VII, when he was Prince of Wales, spent a lot of time in Paris. He loved to be in Paris more than in London because he was a rake. Of course, he was a playboy, and in that time he assembled an entire network. It was often said that his power was greater in Paris than it was in London because he had promoted the careers of people like Poincaré, like Clemenceau, and indeed the guy who did the nuts and bolts work, Théophile Delcassé. And since I'm speaking to Canada, I'm so happy to say a few words in French here. So Théophile Delcassé was a foreign minister and then later ambassador, and again, the dominant figure in foreign policy. Those guys are the ones who actually started the war, right? When the crisis began in Sarajevo, there's plenty of indications that Sarajevo was well known, first of all, to the Russian secret intelligence, that the group in Serbia, Colonel Dimitrievich Apis, and this gang of patsies that he sent in, Gavrilo Princip, this was well known. This was essentially a deployment of the Russian Okhrana, right, the infamous Tsarist secret police. And indeed, we have indications that people in London on the 28th of June, 1914, were eagerly waiting for the news that something big had happened in Sarajevo, and similarly, people in St. Petersburg waiting for the news to come in. So that was the detonator,
Yes.
and then it was this alliance system, right? This system of mobilization armies and rigid war plans that made any war into a general European and indeed world war. And then on the British side, I have to mention, since some of these figures may be familiar, Edward VII promoted a kind of kindergarten of protégés, people that he wanted to put into positions of power. And a lot of these names are the ones that have made the 20th century in particular so tragic. If you know Sir Neville Chamberlain, right, the great appeaser of Hitler, you have to know that his father, Joseph Chamberlain, was someone who had been put in the British cabinet by King Edward VII, promoted his career.
Of course.
Similarly with Sir Winston Churchill, his father, Randolph Churchill, had been put into the British cabinet by King Edward VII, and if Randolph Churchill had not died of syphilis at a young age, he might have had a much bigger career of his own. Sir Jackie Fisher was the head of the British Royal Navy, and he went around making statements that were more incendiary, I think, than anybody in the period going up to World War I. He talked about doing to the German fleet what the Royal Navy had done to the Danish fleet in Copenhagen during World War I, i.e. destroying it with a surprise attack. And then we have Sir Edward Grey. His father was not a distinguished person, but he became an equerry, that is to say a house servant and a clerk in the royal household. But Sir Edward Grey then became the foreign minister, right, the foreign secretary of Great Britain. And it was Sir Edward Grey who managed to goad the British Parliament into declaring war in the first days of August 1914. And all of this was done under false premises, especially from the British and the Empire point of view. I think we can say that it's a tissue of lies. Yeah. That the people in the Liberal Party cabinet, that is to say, Asquith, the Prime Minister, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, they were guilty of blatant criminal lying to the House of Commons, because they were often asked, do you have secret military agreements? Do you have secret military conventions with Russia and with France? And they would always deny it. But, of course, they did have such conventions. And that was the problem that Edward Grey had on the famous 3rd of August, 1914, when he had to convince the House of Commons to declare war. But he would have to say, we have to declare war because of those secret agreements which I have been denying all the time. And this was an amazing act of contortionism, demagogy, perfidy, bogus shams, cruel hoaxes, and whatever else you can call it. But he managed to do it. And they referred, of course, to the German atrocities in Belgium. So the result of this is what? 20 million dead, and a catastrophe for Western civilization. And when you look at Ukraine today, you can see that it's still going on, right? Ukraine is a country which never existed, never a Ukraine on the map until 1918. It was created by the Germans in order to get food. In other words, the Germans detached Ukraine from the collapsing Tsarist Empire. By that time, it was already the Bolshevik Soviet Russia, and they did this in a treaty at the beginning of 1918. And the reason they did it is all in the treaty. They said, we want 1 million tons of grain, we want 400 million eggs, we want 50,000 tons of beef, we want manganese, we want wolfram, we want fibers, the other things that Ukraine produces. So if we have a Ukraine crisis that threatens humanity today, a lot of this is deeply rooted in the terrible effects of World War I. We've never stopped paying.
Yes.
But now go back and look at the cynicism. Again, the Sarajevo assassination was certainly planned by the Serbian government. Certainly the Russian government was actively involved in those plans. This is when Russia was the bad guys, right? Not today, but the world does change.
Yes.
So back then, Serbia, Russia, incendiaries, warmongers, and in France, a group of revanchistes, right? People who want revenge for the loss of Alsace-Lorraine and other imagined problems. They're also interested in getting a war. And again, we have it from an official of the Independent Labor Party, a guy by the name of Charles Norman, that he was walking around in the Strand and Fleet Street on the 28th of June, and a guy comes up to him and says, "Have you heard anything from Sarajevo?" His answer is, "What's Sarajevo? Never heard of it." And the guy goes away yelling, "Oh, I hope they didn't screw it up. I hope they did it. I hope they delivered what they promised," right? So you get the idea.
Course,
it's extremely suspicious.
Yes, it is.
And then this network, and of course the theme that all of this can be lumped under is encirclement. If you read the memoirs of the German Emperor William II, he says, my uncle Edward was always trying to encircle me. We have a book by the French, a former French foreign minister, Émile Flourens. It's called La France conquise par Edward VII. France conquered by Edward VII. Amazing. And he's same story, encirclement. We've got sources from Switzerland, right? I believe we have an Italian source saying pretty much the same thing, that the entire purpose of the reign of King Edward was not bigger and better cigars or more elegant, tailors in the London fashion industry, right? But rather, it's this encirclement of Germany, right? The assembling of this two-front war that was then going to crush the superior military power of Germany.
Absolutely.
So what it shows is you've got to look at this question of Anglo-American imperialism then, right? The British then felt threatened by the rise of Germany. Now, switch to today. We've got an Anglo-American, London, Wall Street combination, and they feel very threatened by many things, right? They're part by their own, principally by their own economic decadence, right? By the $2 quadrillion of bankrupt and kited derivatives that continue to clog the New York and London banking systems, right? The headline, the cover story of the London Economist this week is that the U.S. is simply not recovering, right? It's not bouncing back. That's easy because you've got those $2 quadrillion of derivatives that are essentially sucking the credit out of the credit system.
Yes.
And then the response of London and New York to that has been things like the color revolutions, right? The Arab Spring.
Of course.
And there should be no doubt about that. Those are attempts to destroy nation states, to take nation states such as Mubarak's Egypt or Gaddafi's Libya or Assad's Syria, and to simply wreck them, to break them up, to smash them into mini-states, micro-states, failed states, rump states, warlords, and so on down the line. And ultimately, you keep going with that policy, right? You try to take it from the Middle East, where it worked in Libya, to be sure, right? Absolute chaos, right? The U.S. is fleeing as of today. Egypt, there is a strong Nasserist establishment which is now in a backlash mode, and it's attempting to safeguard the survival of Egypt. And I hope that General Sisi succeeds because I think he's one of the most positive things that's come on the scene. Assad in Syria has also proven much more difficult to defeat, and they've decided to expand that conflict into Iraq with this so-called ISIS, right?
Yes.
ISIS being a creation of U.S., Britain, France, NATO, paid for by the Saudis.
Sounds significantly like Cobra, if you ask me.
I'm sorry?
It sounds significantly like, we mentioned this before, how children become indoctrinated through various mediums. One being television cartoons, and you have your G.I. Joe versus Cobra. It's always
well, again, this
Cobra,
is,
ISIS.
At the level of international politics. I don't know whether the comparison helps us or takes us away. Right? This is the big picture. Right? La grande politique is what we're dealing with. So. But you take the same policy of color revolutions, right? There was a color revolution in Ukraine, 2004, which partially smashed the Ukrainian polity. And now there was an attempt to have yet another color revolution, this time using not the Golden Youth, who had been chewed up the previous time, but now fascists, right? Neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, this fascist cult in Lvov or Lviv or Lemberg, Leopold in French, right? This awful town in the far west of Ukraine, which is the center of this, again, revanchist thinking, right? Hatred of Russia, hatred of the Soviet Union, nostalgia for Hitler. And at a certain point, by pushing that forward, right, the crisis in Ukraine becomes a challenge to Russia when the U.S. and NATO insist on staging this coup on the 21st of February of this year and installing a fascist government. There's no other way to put it, right? Svoboda is fascist, the right sector, Pravi sector, fascist, and the business-suited characters, right, like Yatsenyuk and so forth, they're fascist too in their own way, because what they're coming in with is the International Monetary Fund austerity program, which calls for what? The looting of the Black Earth region of Ukrainian agriculture. It calls for the transfer of the Ukrainian pipeline system to a company like Chevron for essentially nothing, for doubling the price of natural gas, for essentially destroying the social safety net for children, for pregnant women, for old people, for the sick, right? All of that is going to be swept away.
Just amazing.
So the typical IMF shock therapy, and naturally a huge backlash against that. And when the Russophobic, fascistic tendencies of this Kiev fascist clique became clear in February and March, and naturally an armed resistance developed in the eastern part of the country. So you can see it's out of the desperate measures to save the empire are the ones that are generating these clashes. And what Putin's doing, I think, is simply defensive. This is not an offensive plan in any sense. He's simply attempting to prevent this lunatic policy of driving the NATO sphere right up to the Russian border, which there had been pledges made in the early 1990s, which I can recall very well, that NATO would not even move into East Germany, the former DDR. No NATO in the eastern part of Germany, and by implication, no place further east than that. But then instead, we've got to have Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, right? Canadians may be surprised to know that they are pledged to fight and die for cliques of Russophobic hotheads and neo-fascists in those Baltic states. Same thing ultimately for Poland with somebody like Sikorsky. And there's even an attempt then to include Georgia under this Saakashvili, who was he's not in power anymore, but this was certainly a fascist who himself attacked Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about lunacy. That's what he did in August of 2008. So that's what we're living through right now. So there's a great similarity between the Sarajevo period and, what can we call it, the Torres period. Torres, I guess, is the biggest town close to the crash site of this airplane.
And that's something
Ukraine.
that I was gonna mention, just in terms of what you said about the defensive position of Russia. It's really interesting. I'll just bring this up, maybe if you want to touch on it. One of my former guests on the show, he's a student actually for the University of Manitoba. He was speaking about Russia, geopolitics, etc., and he talked about how it was really interesting to him how quickly violence erupted right after the Olympics in Russia. And he said that this was an example of why the defensive theory was more appropriate, because after spending billions to improve basically your PR campaign, billions of dollars, to then be drawn into that conflict, it just didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. And I thought that was very interesting, because it seems like they were almost, what's the word I'm looking for here? They were brought in, as opposed to having the initial intent to strike first. And that was an interesting opportunity I saw from a propaganda standpoint to kind of discredit and to demonize the Russians a bit further. Also, in regards to, you just mentioned the Malaysian flight that was downed. Previously, the same guest had made a comparison, or hadn't made the comparison. I'm drawing the comparison, but had mentioned that in the news had been reporting that surface-to-air missiles had been stolen, and he was under the notion. He had actually made a bold statement and said that he believed that it was possible for the Russians to use those to blame on the Ukrainians, the anti-separatists, and to use that as a pretext for further invasion. And now we're in this situation where we can actually see the opposite is taking place. But I just wanted to mention that in the previous episode.
Yeah, look, on that, if you want to use the good old cui bono, cui prodest argument, and it's pretty obvious that no benefit has accrued
absolutely
to any Ukrainian separatist or to Putin from this hysteria, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And to begin with, we have to say, isn't it strange that 300 people on this plane, in the eyes of the controlled NATO media, are worth far more than 1,100 Palestinians who have been killed? They seem to count for nothing. There's no tears for them, no funeral broadcasts on CNN with chauvinistic rhetoric from Wolf Blitzer or
absolutely.
from Anderson Cooper or from this Richard Quest, who I think probably should be under the care of a psychiatrist at this point. But let's just take off some of the things with this incident, right? Obviously, gross negligence to fly over a war zone. This is crazy. You shouldn't do it, right? So, as we once had a debate here in the United States during World War I, should you send merchant ships into the war zones of the combatants of World War I? And one senator said, "Look, if you insist on walking through a brawl, you're going to get punched." So that, I think, would have been good advice for the people running aircraft, right? Because it would have removed the possibility for anybody to hit this plane. But
absolutely,
remember, all the weapons that Russia has, at least the ones of a certain age, Ukraine has too. So these Buk batteries, whatever they are, SAM-11s, surface-to-air missiles, everybody in the Ukrainian military who has to do with these air defense questions is perfectly capable of running a Buk battery. So you would have to show that the Ukrainian Buk batteries were not involved, and they could very well have been involved. Then you have the other story coming from Russia, which is that there were fighter aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force in the immediate area. So there's no guarantee that it's a surface-to-air missile. It could have been an air-to-air missile, would have done exactly the same job. And then we have this interesting question, Operation Sea Breeze 2014. Traditionally, there's been a summer exercise by the NATO navies in the Black Sea, and in recent years, this has involved Ukrainian ports, Odessa in particular. And I can remember a couple of years ago, during the Iraq War, at the high points of it, there were large demonstrations by Ukrainian citizens telling the NATO warships to get out of those ports. Well, this year we haven't had Operation Sea Breeze 2014, but according to Wayne Madsen, who gets his sources, he's told things from the NSA and other sources, what we have had is Operation Breeze 2014, and this has included ships from quite a number of NATO navies. Canada is not on my list, but what we have is Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, United Kingdom, Greece, Spain, Italy, France, U.S. And they've been in the Black Sea. The U.S. contingent is led by the Aegis cruiser, the Vela Gulf, USS Vela Gulf, which has this Aegis radar, which can look far into the interior of the Ukraine, and they've also got AWACS aircraft, right? High-flying surveillance aircraft that can look for hundreds of miles over the horizon. And what given the fact that these large operations are typically done by making drills go live, right? Taking drills and flipping them live. This is the thesis of my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA. I hope people will read that book, especially the 5th edition. If you don't have the 5th edition, you've cheated yourself of some of the most important things. And I'm up to about 45 drills, exercises, and other events that are associated with 9/11 that essentially prepared and executed every aspect, all the principal features, the memes and the components of 9/11, all related to, created by, prepared by these drills. So now when we look at Ukraine, we find a somewhat murky drill, right, going from sea breeze to breeze, but with plenty of Aegis and plenty of AWACS that would have been necessary to, or would have been highly useful at least in arranging and executing what we've seen. So I would not believe any of this stuff. There is, of course, a conflict inside the U.S. Intelligence about this, right? Because Tuesday of last week, you had unnamed high intelligence officials, and I don't know who they are because this is the so-called off-the-record stuff, right? The ground rules of the briefing are you can't say who's talking. But who could it have been? Brennan of the CIA? I honestly don't know. But their word is the United States has no proof that would indicate a direct role of Russia in this.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at least that much. And then beyond that, what proof do you have that these much maligned and much demonized pro-Russian separatist or federalist forces, whatever you want to call them, in Donetsk, Lugansk, how can you say that they're responsible based, again, on no proof? You can't start World War III based on social media, can you? Because of somebody putting some picture of something on Twitter or Facebook. And even those, right? The picture of the Buk launcher with one rocket missing, traveling, off the screen. Mm-hmm. The Russians have put up that, if you look at the street signs and so forth, you'll find that this is not at all where it was accused of being. Mm-hmm. But principally that there is a faction in the CIA that says, look, you have no proof here, and it's better to not to insist too much on something where the basis of it is so sketchy. So I would recommend everybody back off. Now, the Australian Prime Minister, I think, he has called into question his mental stability. That is, that guy seems to be non compos mentis.
Yes. Cameron,
having jettisoned Haig from the Foreign Office, now has a new guy. He seems to be going nuts. The difference with Cameron is that he tries to direct it against the French. This is actually quite interesting and funny, right? That the old tensions are still so deep, right? Because what Cameron is not really so worried about people getting killed in an airplane crash. What he's concerned about is that France is getting a couple of $2 billion for these helicopter carrier landing ships that the French are selling to Russia. Yes. And again, Harper seems to be harping. He's getting into the act too. So
amazingly, it's a gonger.
You've got to go back to 1914, right? The question in 1914 is what secret diplomacy, what secret agreements are going to be used to drag not just the British people, but the entire empire, right? At that time, about 430 million people in the British Empire were in effect dragged into war based on the raving lies of Sir Edward Grey. And again, Sir Edward Grey was the keeper of the Edwardian flame. He was the spiritual prolongation of the outlook of King Edward VII. And how many families do you know? People that suffered in this. I have one relative of mine on the British side was killed at Gallipoli, blown up at Gallipoli, thanks to the stupidity of Sir Winston Churchill, mm-hmm. in addition to this other group. So the Edward VII networks. I feel like I've got a personal family feud with Edward VII. And I've also got my own father was in World War I. He was on a destroyer escort in the North Atlantic, and he got respiratory problems, which were the main factor in his death about 30 years after the end of World War I. And I'm sure if you go around and talk to people, Canada, Australia, of course, the Gallipoli story still rankles a great deal, but think about all the war dead, and for what?
Mm-hmm.
I would urge people, because of course today it's much worse. Get that old movie out, The Day After, from 1983, 84, right? From the year that Reagan put the Euro missiles into Europe, and now contemplate: is it worth it? Right?
Yeah.
Watch that movie to the bitter end with Jason Robards.
What do you think would be the? Let's say, for instance, that the United States they made this decision to inflame this idea that the Russians potentially were responsible for what took place with the Malaysian air flight. What do you think their end game was? What do you think what were they trying to accomplish through that?
It's always at this phase. It's to get everybody ganging up on Russia, right? To try to isolate Russia. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, right? Because Russia has just come out of a series of tremendous diplomatic successes. I mean, one is the $500 to $600 billion deal between Russia and China for the extraction and export of natural gas from Siberia into China, right? One of the biggest deals of the century, for sure, maybe the biggest of this current century that we're in. And, of course, we've just had the Fortaleza summit of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But that was also attended by, in total, it was about 15 countries, including really important ones like, say, Argentina, right? Rodriguez de Kirchner was there, too. And they have created something that I think is extremely encouraging and a very hopeful sign, which is this BRICS Bank. That is to say, a $500 billion multilateral development bank, along with a $100 billion currency fund. So what I'm interested in is the development bank. But they also need to defend their currencies against possible Anglo-American attack, right, using credit default swaps. But the $50 billion BRICS Bank is the most serious challenge to be mounted against the world domination of the International Monetary Fund since 1944.
Okay.
And the International Monetary Fund is indeed, in some ways, is the center of the world problem, right? Why do we not have economic development? Why do we have continuing backwardness, illiteracy, child mortality, wretched poverty all around the world? This is because of the Washington consensus, right? This neoliberal rant that they have: deregulation, privatization, destroy the social safety net, bust the unions, race to the bottom, right? All of this essentially rolling back the American New Deal, which had gained dominance over a lot of the world, and now we're going back to this low-wage economic system. So very welcome is a challenge to the IMF. Now, you may remember in 1998, during the so-called Asian contagion, there had been an attempt led by Japan to create an Asian monetary fund, and that would have been a great thing. That would have been just the ticket. But at that point, the U.S. and the British were strong enough to crush that attempt. But now, given the progressive weakening, really the mismanagement of the Anglo-American bloc, that bloc is now unable to prevent the BRICS and their allies, especially in Latin America, right? Brazil and Argentina, practically the ball game. Venezuela was also there, and some others. They haven't been able to stop the creation of the BRICS Bank. So, who can say that Russia is going to be isolated? Unfortunately, though, when you see something like the BRICS Bank, you have to remember, for the Anglo-Americans, that is casus belli. And I think this is an important strategic principle. The Anglo-American empire is not based primarily on occupying this or that piece of territory, right? This or that piece of mud. That's not the idea. The strength of the Anglo-Americans has always been domination through world financial hegemony. So you've got the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, various regional institutions tied to them, and then you've got NATO as a military enforcer, debt collector, and so forth. So what's going on now with the BRICS Bank is a direct challenge. And indeed, when the BRICS Bank was announced at the end of the Fortaleza summit, it was clearly only a question of time until some escalation came from the London and Wall Street group. So that's what we're having. The other thing, though, is when you talk to a neocon here in Washington, or indeed when you talk to a humanitarian bomber, the responsibility to protect people, right? The Samantha Power types,
Okay.
right, who do it under left cover.
Yes.
And the bombing is the same, but the explanations are slightly different. They will always reveal that ultimately they think that if you have a thermonuclear confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, that Russia will back down.
Yes.
And that China will back down. And unfortunately, this is anything but guaranteed, anything but. And I don't want to find out. I don't want to test this. I am not interested in this.
No, absolutely. I mean, the ultimate objective, I think, from people like you and people like me is to inform and educate people so that they can not only inform and educate the public, their community, but also to empower themselves to realize that what's taking place in the world is very complicated, yes. But if you pay attention to what's taking place, the stories you follow, say, for instance, even as I've been following your work, you can start to piece things together, and there are patterns. And then suddenly, after a period of time, it becomes less confusing, and it becomes almost self-explanatory. You see a headline, and you're able to decipher it in a brand new way. You're able to understand the realm of geopolitics with a brand new vision, and when you do that, you open yourself up to, I think, maybe exposing to a certain degree some of the lies that the politicians and these world powers are sharing with us. And by doing so, I believe that to some degree helps to hold back this assault on us in regards to pushing us towards some type of global war scenario. And
all right, that's certainly true. But now let's talk Turkey. Now you represent a university community there, right?
Absolutely.
There's a tremendous role for scholars and professors and even people in think tanks, and it would go something like this.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Stephen Cohen, an eminent academic. I've criticized him over the years for questions of Russian history and other things, but those things are not so important when you're gaping into the abyss. You've got to try to be as inclusive as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So Stephen Cohen, formerly he's Princeton emeritus, and I think he's NYU, New York University emeritus, right? And his charming wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation, right, the American left liberal organ, they have been going around, and Cohen is correct, right? He points to the fact that there's a tremendous danger in Ukraine. He talks about the danger of limited nuclear war as something that you can see very closely. Let me hasten to premise that since 2004, I have been trying to argue that Ukraine is in some ways the most dangerous real estate in the world because it's the one place where you can easily imagine a clash between nuclear-armed adversaries. Nowhere in the Middle East, so far as we know, is this given, right? Middle East is dangerous, but not like this. If you have a civil war in Ukraine, which you now have, suppose you have Polish NATO troops, and the hotheads in Warsaw are perfectly capable of this because they actually want to grab a piece of Ukraine. They have an ulterior motive. But if you have Polish NATO troops coming in from the west, Russian troops coming in from the east, the Russian troops have their own nuclear weapons. The Poles would expect to demand the nuclear umbrella from the United States. You could have a nuclear exchange growing out of Ukraine. That's hardly given in any other part of the world. So the question is action. Now, what Cohen and vanden Heuvel have argued is that we are much weaker today in the sense that the organizations, the lobbies, the mobilization capabilities for public opinion are far weaker because we've got, not only do we have these mad dog warmonger neocons, but again, we've got the leftist version. We've got the humanitarian bombers, the Samantha Power people, right? So the social base for saying no to war has somehow diminished. And, of course, a lot of people think that they're doing Obama a favor by allowing this war hysteria to build. So what Cohen and vanden Heuvel have they've essentially talked about the need for some kind of mobilization. And unfortunately, they have not been very specific. But I'd like to be specific. And the professors there in Manitoba are as good a place to begin as anywhere.
Absolutely.
There's got to be, in particular in the English-speaking world, a mass mobilization of people with some influence and some ability to command media attention and simply to educate